If what you want to do when you're communicating thinking is to induce thinking, then you need short, sharp bites. And so philosophers have been tuned into that from time to time. And I think Twitter, in a way, provides a kind of ongoing invitation to recover that.
You're listening to the Futures Podcast with me, Luke Robert Mason, live from the University of Warwick. On this show, we meet the scientists, technologists, artists, and philosophers working to imagine the sorts of developments that might dramatically alter what it means to be human. Some of their predictions will be preferable, others might seem impossible, but none of them are inevitable. My name is Luke Robert Mason, and I'm your host for this evening. In 2011, I introduced my PhD supervisor, Professor Steve Fuller, to Twitter. Steve took to this platform with ease, and over the past 14 years, it has been the way I access his often uncensored mind. Anyone who follows at Prof. Steve Fuller on Twitter, now X, will know how Steve uses a platform as his own personal notebook of ideas generation, testing concepts in the wild and experimenting on, I put on audiences, but also how audiences respond to whatever he is thinking about presently. But being an academic, Steve couldn't help but write a book about this lived experience, media and the power of knowledge. The book provides a roadmap for how intellectuals can communicate their ideas in the ever-evolving media environment of the 21st century. This live podcast, what you've joined today, is an attempt to put those theories into practice. There is no better space that encourages the performance of ideas than a black box studio. Spaces like this have always been where I do my best thinking, in the live, improvisational, interactive, and conversational moment. So to show us how we can become the prophets of new media platforms, please put your hands together and join me in welcoming Professor Steve Fuller to the Futures Podcast stage.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for the audience.
So, Steve, I'm going to ask you this question because people may not know, but I was the reason Steve Fuller ended up on Twitter in 2011, and it's been 14 and a half years and 43,000 tweets later. And I guess my question is, do you regret that decision?
Well, if I do by now, I'm a glutton for punishment. No, not at all. In fact, I would say, this is something I raise in the book, but I think is worth thinking about, that Twitter is actually very much a disciplining medium in terms of the way in which you communicate, because, the 140 character tweet used to be 280, but it got cut down. This seems to me very uncharacteristic of the way in which academics communicate. We usually like to write books and articles with long paragraphs and big words and complex sentence structures. But with something like Twitter, you have to get the point across quickly, especially in a world that has become quite accustomed to short attention spans. And this is really quite a challenge for academics, because academics often think that the depth of their thinking can only be reflected in the complexity of their expression. And that's not necessarily true. And so from a personal experience about self-disciplining in the way one communicates, Twitter's been marvelous. Okay, but in a sense, I kind of had a sense of what I was getting myself into. And this has a lot to do with knowing something about the history of media and art and the way in which the medium, right, in a way disciplines the message generally. And that's why Marshall McLuhan, for example, plays a very big role in my book.
I want to talk to you about that disciplining process. So the ability to take an idea and reduce it down is called something, an aphorism.
Right.
And you write in depth about the aphorism in the book and the revival, or perhaps the retrieval in a McLuhanist sense, of the aphorism through Twitter. What role does that play in how we shape ideas, and what use does the aphorism have?
Well, I think it's always worth recalling that the aphorism was sort of the original medium in which philosophy was expressed, both in the Eastern and the Western cultures, and the Eastern cultures in a way held on to it longer. Okay, but nevertheless, there have been periods in the history of the West where aphoristic expression has in fact been highly valued and quite influential and important. And even in our own time, we might think about somebody, well, first in the early modern period, someone like Pascal, okay? Blaise Pascal, a very important kind of religious thinker, but he's the one who said the heart has its reasons, okay? You're probably familiar with that. But then if you go into the more recent past, right, the last 150 years or so, we can think about people like Nietzsche and Wittgenstein, who are very influential philosophers, but whose primary mode of expression was in this relatively short kind of form. And in fact, both of them highly valued that short form. So in other words, it was a deliberate mode of expression. And there's a lot to be said about this, because part of what you want when you're communicating thinking is that you want to induce thinking in the people you're talking to. And one of the problems with the rather long-winded way in which academics operate is that we can bludgeon people with our knowledge. Right? So in other words, you go through these long paragraphs, you hear these people go on at great length, and you don't feel like you've been, empowered with thought, right? You feel you've been sort of verbally beaten, into submission, right? Yes, I believe, stop talking. And I think if what you want to do when, you're communicating thinking is to induce thinking, then you need short, sharp bites, right? And that was certainly the case with Nietzsche and Wittgenstein. That was what they were trying to do, and they were quite deliberate about it. But of course, if one thinks about poetry as a kind of model for communication, right, where in a very short compass, poetry can express many things at many different levels at once. And the fact that people feel very kind of empowered and even enchanted by poetry, right, is an indication of what that kind of you might say telegraphic form of communication can do. And so philosophers have been tuned into that from time to time. And I think Twitter in a way provides a kind of ongoing invitation to recover that.
So now I'm curious, Steve, how has Twitter disciplined your thinking? Were there people who were feeling bludgeoned by your ideas before you joined in 2011?
I mean, obviously it hasn't inhibited my tendency to write books, right? So that hasn't ended. Right. But I do think in terms of style, one thing I would say is that I have become over the years much more careful about weighing the words. Right? So if you read any of my stuff, I'll just, not to discourage you from reading any of my stuff, but the point is, I think one thing that most people would say about the kind of style of writing I have is it's highly compressed. Right? So in other words, there's, in one paragraph, there's enough that maybe 3 paragraphs would normally express. And I think in that respect, Twitter actually has had quite a lot of influence, right? Because in a sense, you can actually, in let's say 5 tweets, you could do like 5 paragraphs. And one of the things that I talk about in the book, in that chapter on aphorism, which is the largest chapter in the book, early on in Twitter, there was this thing, the Twitter University, the Swedish Twitter University, okay? And so this is around the year 2012. And the Swedish Twitter University invited academics, Twitgensteins, to actually develop lectures consisting of 25 consecutive tweets, right? So where the argument for an entire course would be made in 25 tweets, one following another. And this was a very interesting experiment. I think about 15 people, myself included, volunteered to do this. And I thought that was really quite a great idea. And at the time, right, the guy who started this thing thought this might take off, right, as a kind of alternative form of education. And I still think it's a good idea, actually. Right, to get some kind of, something that might normally take a course or something that might be regarded as very complex, break it down into 25 consecutive tweets, a bit like a program, right? When you're doing the lines of a program. And so that's an example, right? That's an example where, this kind of medium can enable quite a lot to be conveyed in a very striking manner over a very short space.
Well, there's another power to the aphorism that you explore in the book that I want to unpack a little, which is the ability to place an idea in the world and allow for it to remain open to interpretation as a way to produce new knowledge or perhaps play with ideas.
Yes, that's right. And in a way, this is the the extent to which aphorism is very much like poetry, right? Because when you talk about a great poem, especially when you talk about this is certainly true of modern poems, but not just modern poems. What makes a great poem isn't the particular meaning that the poem has, as if there's this one meaning that the poem has, which once you understand it makes it great. No, usually a poem is great because of the way in which the words and the syntax are arranged, right? It is open to multiple meanings, some of them even mutually exclusive meanings, right? Which in each case is illuminating. Right, and this is something if you're talking about rather long poems, sort of allegorical poems such as Dante's Divine Comedy or Milton's Paradise Lost, right? Those things, because these poems are enormous, right? You can get all kinds of interpretations off of these things, and that is the kind of thing that, generally speaking, you want from communication, right? You want people to find multiple enlightening meanings from the experience, not just get a lot of words and then feel in some sense you're left dumber than you began with.
In fact, I think it may have been advice that you gave me, Steve, that the best lecturers are the ones who allow you to leave the room feeling like you know more than when you came in, as opposed to going...
I know it sounds obvious, but yeah.
But what the hell was that guy just talking about? And in fact, our relationship began when I was an undergraduate here in 2008 to 2011, and you were one of the first academics at the University of Warwick whose books I could actually read. So that was that was part of our
and look what it's done to him.
And look what it's done to me. Now I'm back doing a PhD with Steve. So, something went awry there. I want to double click, though, a little bit more on this thing around aphorism as a way to generate new ideas. Because another thing that you've been interested in, and your last book launch that we shared the stage together, was around post-truth.
Yeah.
And you talk about how aphorisms can create alternative realities, or as you say in the book, alternative ontological interpretations.
Yes.
So how can an aphorism progress science?
Science is very much motivated by metaphors and analogies, okay? So, when we start talking about light, let's say, as waves or particles, right? Those things begin as metaphors and analogies, and then once one thinks through what it's like in the concrete setting, and then imagine what it would be like in this other setting, right? Then you come up with ideas for hypotheses to test, experiments to make, things of that kind. And in a way, you might think of an aphorism, in science as a bit akin to something like a mathematical equation, right? A mathematical equation, in a way, is a bit like an aphorism because there are lots of ways any given equation can be interpreted. So, for example, there's this thing called Boyle's law, which has to do with pressure, and of course this has to do with the movement of gas molecules and things like that normally. But it's also a model that's used to try to explain how revolutionary activity happens in politics. Okay, and it's the same equation, right? And so there are radically different ontologically interpretations, right? Applying to different fields, and nevertheless, in both cases, they're illuminating. And I think this is very much like what the aphorism does.
So in that case, how can one utilize that power or leverage that power? How can, as you say in the book, someone write embracing the idea of actual infinity?
I was afraid.
They're your words, Steve.
I know, no, I understand. I mean, see, the idea here is that if you go down one of these paths, as it were, right? So let's, think about, okay, we're going to interpret light as a wave, or we're going to interpret light as a particle, right? At one level, that is kind of bounded, right? Because we're talking about light as a wave or light as a particle. But then all the things you can start to say about light once you start thinking about it as a particle or a wave is potentially infinite, right? So the actual infinity, what makes it bounded is the fact that you have this starting base of saying, I'm going to think about light as a particle. But then what you can say in light of that is infinite, right? Because there are infinite ways in which one might think about light as a particle. Some of them might be more useful than others, of course. But the point is, that's what opens up. That's where you get the infinity.
So how have you personally, I guess, been leveraging that possibility? So 14 and a half years ago, you went on Twitter, you've worked out how to use the power of the aphorism to play with ideas. How have you found this has changed the way in which you present knowledge? You say in the book, intellectual prosody, which is a rhythm to thought made because of the constraint of the medium. Have you seen the rhythm of your thought change thanks to things like Twitter? And has it changed how you presented and wrote this book?
See, the whole business about this intellectual prosody is you have to get the rhythm in which people are thinking. And the rhythm in which people are thinking have to do with the media through which they are thinking. Again, this is a very McLuhan-esque point. And if people are thinking in terms of these kind of, tweet-sized thoughts, right, then your own thinking in a way has to engage with that, right? It has to be, as it were, you have to be able to, people have to be able to assimilate you at that level, right? And so this then does put a kind of constraint on what you're doing and how much you can say and how do you say it and so forth. And if you do want to say a lot in a little space, you have to be very artful about it. And being artful about it may, involve using metaphors or turns of phrases in a very clever kind of way, where you can pack a lot in, right, in a certain kind of small space. Obviously, that requires a certain kind of mastery of language, right? So it's a very literary thing at the end of the day.
Do you think it helps with teaching, insofar as you were just mentioning there about meeting audiences where they are? Some of my favorite tweets of yours are where you simply tweet mood and then a link to a music artist.
That's right.
And I'm always surprised by who you're listening to.
Yeah.
But your ability to, I'm saying this as if I'm surprised that academics exist outside of the institution, but your ability to exist within the world, I mean, this is some of the stuff your undergraduates that you teach are listening to, are consuming. Do you think your ability to use and engage with these platforms, to be culturally aware of what's hot and what's not, you teach a media course, which was the outline or the underline of this book, do you think it enables you to teach better, to repackage the knowledge into a way in which undergraduates...
Okay, so you're opening up a very big sort of issue about how you generally prepare your mind in the kind of world we live in.
Okay.
Right, because, I think, to sort of take a couple of steps back and to answer your question, I think one of the things that would be very apparent to me, but perhaps, you don't have to go through this. I'm not a digital native, right? I was born and lived in a time before we had the internet, right? And the internet came very quickly once it started, right? And all the other things came very quickly too, time-wise. And a lot of academics and older people got left behind, basically. And in a way, they're the ones who provide the most negative reaction to what's going on. And in a sense, they legitimize the negative reaction that other younger people might be feeling. I've never felt that way. I think, and then in this respect, I've always been sort of on McLuhan's wavelength. So my knowledge of McLuhan, goes, from my university, maybe even high school days. And the idea here is that you do have to surf the media, right? You have to be on top of it. And so, for example, when I'm working, because most of the time I'm tweeting, all these tweets that he talks about are happening while I'm working, right? When I'm in front of a computer typing. And the tweets are effectively, like he said in the beginning, they're like notes. It's almost like froth. It's almost like, the side things you're thinking about while you're doing the thing you're supposed to do. Right? And that's kind of where the tweets are. So the tweets aren't necessarily about what I'm working on at the moment, but it's about the thoughts that come to my mind while I'm working. And the point about that is what keeps all that kind of coherent to me, and this is where the music comes in. I always listen to music while I'm working. And what that does is it creates a kind of zone, right? A kind of media zone, you might say, a kind of, audio-visual landscape in which your thought can be conducted. And it's one that is quite portable as well, right? Because you can be typing and listening to music on a train, in your living room, in your office, walking around even potentially. And so you carry that with you. And I always try to make sure that part of the music, and it's not so hard, right, is contemporary, right? It's always kind of contemporary. And so I have a certain kind of vibe in my head about how people are feeling and thinking. That's sort of the background noise. And that really does help when it then comes down to, let's say, facing a classroom or facing a new audience, especially an audience of young people.
What I guess I was getting at was what you talk about in the book is the intellectual as a performer.
Sure.
So how do intellectuals develop skills to translate across media? And how is this, as you say, a form of method acting?
I've written a lot about the intellectuals over the years, the nature of the intellectual. And I'm someone who believes that actually just because you're an academic doesn't mean you're an intellectual. So I hold this rather, what within the academy is a rather controversial view, because academics usually like to draw a distinction between intellectuals as a kind of general category, which also includes academics, as well as what academics call public intellectuals, right? Right? Public intellectuals is a term invented by academics, okay? So they can include themselves as intellectuals as well, right? I actually don't think this distinction holds water. I think it's a obviously self-serving distinction. I think actually the public intellectuals are the intellectuals, and they've always been recognized as such. And when the term intellectual starts to get currency in the late 19th century, it's the public people who are called the intellectuals, not the academics. The academics only become intellectuals when they go public, right? But as long as they stay in the classroom, they're not intellectuals, right? And that had a lot to do with how one imagines what happens in a classroom, right? Because if you imagine, your sort of classic classroom experience, it isn't about communicating with students. It's about unloading knowledge on students, right? So you're not trying to persuade the students of anything. The students are already persuaded because they need to get a mark from you, right? So there's no persuasion going on here at all, right? What there is the student desperately trying to figure out, what do I need to know to get the A? Okay, and so that is not an intellectual experience, right? That is just a desperate grasp for credentials, okay? And most of academic communication with students is basically that. Now, that doesn't mean academics can't do the intellectual thing, but when they do, the whole rhetorical setup is radically different. It's a much more egalitarian one in a certain way. In other words, you don't come in with the audience already agreeing with you, already being forced to agree with you, right? Because you hold so much power over them. The intellectual, in a way, is quite accountable to their audience, right? And if you know anything about the history of intellectuals, you will know that they tend to get into trouble, right? Because they aggravate people. They aggravate people not because people don't understand them, right? Or feel too stupid around them, but because they understand them all too well, right? Now that is a success of communication, right? When you can insult people and people recognize they're being insulted, you're making progress here. Academics insult people all the time, but the people being insulted don't understand what they're saying, right? It's a big difference, right? That's a big difference.
Oh, I've just realized something. But in these platforms, let's take one step back.
All right. I didn't fully answer your question yet, but I was just getting going.
We were getting there. But I want to take one quick step back about where these intellectuals, these public intellectuals, whatever you want to call them, where they operate. Because in these platforms, it's not just, Twitter's not this egalitarian intellectual space. It is a place for the sage, but it's also a place for the propagandist, the advertiser, the conspiracist, the fantasist. They all exist together on the same platform. Yeah. So how do we navigate if that is the environment in which now they find themselves?
Look, I am inclined to treat all of these characters you've just mentioned as pretty much in the same basket, right? And that, the person we call a sage versus the person we call a propagandist, right? A fantasist even, right? Or an intellectual. A lot depends on the framing of what the person is saying, rather than anything you can say very specific about the person themselves, but a lot about the framing. And I think one of the things that that we have seen in our time with social media, in fact, I brought this up in one of my seminars today. There is this thing called the Overton window. Maybe some people are familiar with this. The Overton window, you know about this, right? And the idea here, and this is an idea that in a way has gotten a lot of currency because of social media, and it's about framing, about what is considered acceptable and not acceptable to say. And one talks about the opening and the closing and the shifting of the Overton window in that regard, right? So certain things that people would never consider possible now are considered very possible, and vice versa, right? And then different groups have different Overton windows, as it were. Okay, and one of the big problems with the post-truth condition is that the Overton windows don't match up, right? Everybody's is different, and it's constantly moving around. And so one person's sage is another person's fantasist, right? So that's what it boils down to. And so the intellectual space is very fluid in that way. And so intellectual then just becomes a very general word for the people who are in fact trying to address the audience, about ideational things about what they should believe, what they should think, and that sort of thing. But who gets taken seriously and not seriously is really quite an open question.
But do you think that has in part to do with audience capture? So if attention is the economy of the online environment, do you think that some intellectuals gravitate to what they know will get an audience response? In fact, you say in the book that you often find that public intellectuals gravitate towards the most controversial topics.
But that's a different issue, right? I mean, they do that as a matter of principle. In a sense, we're talking about two things at once, right? Because the intellectuals tend to get into trouble because they're not predictable, right? They tend to be mercurial sorts of people. I think what we're talking about in social media is a kind of transformation process, which may begin, so I think, right, I think this is true of it. This is probably true of you too. Be
careful what you say. I have control of the edit.
I understand. No, but the point is that I think when people want to address a large audience on intellectual matters through social media, let's say through a podcast, right? In the first case, I don't think most of these people do market research. I think what they do, right? What they do is they go out there and do their thing, in a sense. Right? And as the audiences respond, in a sense, their thing gets refined, right? And then you grow the audience, and then you can expand outward. And then after a while, right, this then becomes your signature thing, right? You've got this kind of cache and, of people who will always be listening to you. And in fact, you can kind of parlay that for other forms of capital, of course, right? If you could say, I have 300,000 people are listening to me, say my thing, right? In a sense, that can be used to leverage to get other things, right? Sponsorship, whatever. And so that's a different kind of game, right? It's certainly an intellectual game, but it's one that's very much molded by the distinctiveness of social media, right? So in a sense, that's where social media, in a way, is doing something to the intellectual. When we talk about technology determining the way people think, we sometimes use the word determining too strongly, right? Social media actually is a relatively free-form technology. And it's not, yes, you can get 300,000 people who are wanting to listen to you. But, at the end of the day, you like that, right? You want that, right? In a sense, that becomes part of who you are. So it's a kind of mutually determining thing. It isn't just, Jordan Peterson being captured. My God, how did those millions of people capture this great mind? No, he's complicit in it very clearly, right? And there are people, and this is where we get back to the classic intellectual, there will be a certain kind of person who at some point will disown their followers, right? And will, in a sense, say, look, I'm going to shed 100,000 people. I don't care, because this is what my view really is. And that is more like the classical intellectual, right? So the classical intellectual typically gets a platform. A lot of people think this person's courageous or smart or whatever, and they follow him. But then one day, this guy decides on another issue to say something completely crazy, right? And then everybody goes nuts, and sometimes these people get killed, and all that kind of stuff happens, right? And so this is the thing that you would want to be looking for in the podcasters to kind of mirror the experience of the classical intellectual. The podcaster who at some point, after they get their couple of 100,000, 2 million followers, suddenly say, look, I've been talking about this stuff for a long time, and I'm listening to the sound of my voice, and I don't like what I hear. And so now I am going to change my tune. right? That is kind of more like, and that's what gives the intellectual an integrity, right? Because it looks like this person is not being driven by the fans, but rather is someone who's autonomous, right? Someone who directs themselves. And so when they hear their own voice and they don't like what they hear, they have the power to change themselves.
You mentioned the podcasters.
Remember Christopher Hitchens?
Yeah,
Christopher Hitchens
okay.
is a great example of what I'm talking about. This is a guy, right, who went from the left, very left, right, and over the course of events, right, in the 1980s and 90s into the 2000s, gradually sort of came in line with the neoconservatives. Right? It's a kind of interesting thing. And it wasn't an overnight thing either. It was just that as he was thinking and talking about the events of the world as they were unfolding, it changed his mind. And that's a real intellectual.
The ability to change one's mind.
Yes, and do it publicly. Do it publicly. Do it in real time. Right? And the thing is, social media, in a way, is very challenging for this, right? Because social media has everything in real time. Everything is public. And in a sense, if you're Jordan Peterson, you have to have three podcasts out there a day to keep the fans happy, right? And so you don't actually have a lot of time in a way to recoup, right? And if all of a sudden your next podcast says, I'm doing a 180 on this, right? People will just go nuts and think you're crazy.
You got to redo the podcast tour. But you mentioned podcasting there, and the reason, not just because I have a podcast, but the reason I'm interested in podcasting is because to some degree that does define what ideas get platformed, what ideas get attention. You look at the major podcasters, the Joe Rogans, the Chris Williamson, the Stephen Bartletts. They become the arbiters of whose ideas we get to hear and in what format we get to hear them. Do you think this is anything new, or is this just a different iteration of what has come before?
Well, I think ultimately that's not one of the newer things. Okay, so I would say if you look at newspapers, right, in terms of especially in the period when newspapers were controlled by great media moguls, right, in a sense, those guys, right, actually had control over who would actually be writing, the opinion pages on their, in the newspaper. Right. And very often they had to fit certain kinds of ideological lines. Certainly this is true in this country. And what that meant was that certain kinds of voices just never had a platform. If anything, we are living in a period where it has become easier for marginalized voices to get platforms. Right. I mean, and yes, one of the consequences is that the platforms that exist now, some of them can become huge and enormous. But, in a sense, somebody like Joe Rogan, who is a big deal, right, in the platform world. I don't know if he's a much bigger deal than, let's say, the New York Times was in its heyday, or the Times of London, right? If you look at the 20th century or 19th century, right? I mean, I don't know if Joe Rogan is bigger than what those institutions were back then in terms of being able to foreground certain kinds of ideas and not. So I don't think that aspect, even though the medium's changed, I don't think that aspect has changed so much.
Well, it's quite clear in the book that some things just haven't changed. I mean, you go as far back as Socrates and Jesus. How have these voices been recognized and then recognized through different forms of mass communication?
Well, I think one of the things that you might say has helped Socrates and Jesus' media phenomena is the fact that they didn't write anything. In other words, everybody else is writing about them. And in fact, both of them had extremely good publicists, in particular, St. Paul for Jesus and Plato for Socrates. And of course, both of these guys, St. Paul and Plato, were writing after Jesus and Socrates died. So there wasn't, anything that could be complained about. And of course, they weren't the only ones who wrote about these guys, right? All kinds of people did. And one of the things that I point out in this chapter, so I have a chapter on basically Socrates and Jesus as media personalities, is that they were celebrities in the literal sense of the word from Latin, which has to do with frequency. Some things is, so in other words, people are always talking about them. Some, they're very polarizing figures, right? A lot of, there are people who like Socrates and don't like Socrates. There are people who like Jesus and don't like Jesus. But the point is, everybody's got an opinion about them, okay? And that enables then the media cycle to go. And it's one that gets maintained, over many centuries, right? And it's quite an astonishing thing. And in a sense, the historical aspect of these guys doesn't matter so much, right? Because they become kind of free-floating media personalities, right? And so they're adaptable to all kinds of media, right? So you can paint about them, you can write about them, right? You can do anything about them, right? In a sense, they and we might say this is because their spirit lives on. Well, maybe that's what it is, but it does have a kind of a media implication that makes them, in fact, very powerful as media figures.
You mentioned the word powerful. I mean, that is the impetus of the book, the relationship between media and power. And how do we use Marshall McLuhan and Max Weber, who you introduced, to understand that relationship?
If any of you have ever read Marshall McLuhan, you know the man is a very slippery character in terms of what exactly he means by what he says. He's actually very good in this kind of aphoristic style of expression, right? He has all these expressions that you're all familiar with, like the medium is the message, right? But what the hell does it mean? And this is a very, very characteristically aphoristic, where you can have it mean one thing and then have it meaning the opposite thing, and you can see scholars kind of interpreting this in all kinds of ways for their own purposes. Well, so I do this too, and what I'm doing is to take the distinction between hot media and cool media, hot media, cool media, right? Which is a very famous distinction that McLuhan introduces. And I mean, the examples that he gives are fairly straightforward. It's just what he's trying to get across in the distinction. So hot medium would be a book, at least in the beginning. And also would be something like radio. And the idea being that the communication is happening very intensely at one or relatively few dimensions. So in other words, you're being approached in a very specific kind of way, right? So with radio, you're listening. Right, you're not seeing anything, you're listening, and so as a result, you have to create images in your mind about what's going on. So, right, it's hot in that sense, right? And with a book, right, you read the book, and to understand it, you have to imagine things. You have to, and sometimes the book tells you things that kind of propels you to do things. You might be crying as a result of reading the book. You might get angry, right? And so it really, that's what makes it hot, right? The media is hot, but there are other kind of media, and television would be the example that McLuhan always leans back on, right? Which are cool, right? In the sense that you insert yourself into it, right? The media surrounds you, right? And you just have to be there and soak it up, right? You don't have to do much. You just, you can hear it and watch it, and just stay there. And, back in my day, we talked about the couch potatoes, right? These people who would just spend all their time watching television. And that's cool. Right, in the sense that you're cool, you're just chilled, you're just there, right, absorbing stuff. And this is kind of the spirit of the distinction between hot and cool. And what I do with that distinction, which I think is a pretty valid distinction, and I do a couple of things. One thing I do is to say, this is not, you might say, this is not just an absolute distinction, hot and cool, right? Because the thing is, once new media, so new media, in a way, begin hot, right? Because they become something you have to engage directly. It's not like the way you normally do things, right? So if you're going to get something out of it, you got to do something new. But then after a while, you get used to the media, right? And the media, so for example, even with the history of books, right? In the beginning, right, the book that was published was the Bible, which is a very challenging book, right? Even if you can read. But after a while, books get written that, of course, are kind of closer to the experience of the people who read them, right? And in fact, this is why the people buy them. And so in that sense, then you can read for entertainment, right? You can read, you can read so you can disappear, right? In other words, reading is no longer a challenge. The same thing with radio. Okay, right? You think about the different kinds of music, right? Originally, it was classical music that was on the radio, right? And that's very challenging, right? But then after a while, you get popular music, you get muzak, right? You get all kinds of stuff that, background music. That's a cool medium, right? Radio turns cool then. And then it can heat up again, perhaps, right? So the point is, these are distinctions that can move around. So that's one thing that I do. And I think this is very important with regard to the introduction of the computer medium, which is kind of what this chapter aims at getting us to. You know, what kind of a medium is the digital medium, right, in terms of this McLuhan stuff? Because it's quite clear that the digital medium began as a hot medium. Okay, and you know, the internet was very revolutionary. You know, it empowered new people. It required new skills in a sense, right? But as soon as we started to move into things like smartphones, right, user-friendly devices, which require, in a way, very little knowledge of the technology itself, right? Because everything has been made user-friendly, right? You have interfaces that in a way are designed to make it as easy as possible to access what you want to access, so the technology becomes invisible. Then it becomes a cool medium, right? And it can be, you know, it can not only be cool, you might say it might even become cold if you become dependent on it, right? And that you can't get yourself out of it. So the distinction between you and the medium completely disappears. And so we might be in that state. And so that's kind of, so that's how I plot the McLuhan thing on the digital medium. Now for Max Weber, okay, because this is very important too. Max Weber is one of the classical sociologists, right? One of the founders of the discipline. And he was, and he wrote about many things, and he wrote about the sociology of religion. And he makes a very interesting distinction between two kinds of roles that exist in religions. One of them is the prophet, okay, and the other is the priest. And these are very radically different figures and very often kind of opposed to each other, even if we're talking about the same religion. Now, the prophet is the hot medium, okay? The prophet is the one who is telling you things that you may not have ever heard before or don't even want to hear, right? The prophet is the one who goes out there. But the message is not complete by the prophet, right? The prophet just throws it out there for you, and you have to somehow engage with it, right? It's up to you where you take it. And it's not at all obvious where you go with it, right? So the prophets are the people who found the religion, right? The founders of the religion tend to be the prophets, and then the priests are the people who take the religion in various directions afterwards. They institutionalize the religion. And usually this is after the prophet is dead. It's always very convenient for your prophets to be dead. Sometimes you might even need to kill them in order to have institutionalized religion. And so the thing is that the priests are the people who come up with a kind of normalized way of actually responding to the message. Right, and this is where the message cools down, because there become established ways of following, let's say, in Jesus' footsteps. Right, so it's not just you interpreting Jesus how you feel. Right, it's rather you have to go to church, you have to do this and that and the other thing. You have to engage in these rituals. Right, and all of that then becomes integrated into your life. Right, and so you cannot understand the words of the prophet without doing this normal stuff. Right, and that is the priest. And with every change in technology, right, the originators of the technology tend to be very prophetic figures, but then there are the priests who kind of normalize the usage of it. And this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about, generally speaking, in that chapter.
Do you think the new, I guess not even person, but perhaps entity that is normalizing knowledge is the digital medium itself, AI, because we're seeing more and more these platforms are less and less populated by human beings, and the propagandists, the advertisers, the conspiracists, and the fantasists that we see are AI chatbots. They ape the language that has come before. Do you think they're useful for generating new forms of knowledge, or are they the new prophets, I guess, of what knowledge has been placed into these platforms previously?
Let's put it this way. One of the things that is very was already there when computers started to mediate everything that's happening in the world, right? As soon as computers became kind of the infrastructure of, you know, everything, was that our lives were becoming more integrated with our technology in all kinds of ways, and that's pretty obvious now. Now, with artificial intelligence, that takes it to the next level, because it obviously means a certain kind of integration with our minds. And when we talk about something like generative artificial intelligence and all of the hopes and fears that people attach to it, I think the first thing that is worth pointing out is that the technology is impressive, but of course, what the data is that these technology are feeding on and from which they produce results that we're impressed with is our own stuff, right? And this is where it gets kind of interesting, because this is not really a case of some foreign entity called artificial intelligence potentially eating our minds. No, we've already fed them. We're fed them our minds, right? We're in the process of feeding their minds with us, okay? And then, we are getting results, and often the results can be quite surprising. Why? Well, you might say, well, that's because this AI stuff works really well. Well, obviously, there's an obvious point to that, but also because we ourselves as human beings who have produced the stuff that we put into the AI, we ourselves have never read it properly, we have never understood it properly, we have never processed it properly. We have just produced it. And in a sense, what AI is doing is it is challenging us in a way, right? In a sense, because the AI can do a lot of that kind of processing much more effectively at a much larger scale than the ordinary human being does. But what it does is it reminds us of all the stuff that we ourselves have produced, having to do with knowledge that goes systematically underutilized and maybe even unread altogether. And so that makes it a very interesting, very exciting kind of situation.
Do you then think that AI can perhaps utilize the aphorism to produce, advance, and create new forms of knowledge?
Well, one thing that's very interesting about, if you use like ChatGPT and everything, is that you can customize it indefinitely, right? So in other words, you can tell it how long should the response be, right? So you could, in principle, I would suppose, say, I am trying to come up with a way of encapsulating this very complicated thought, and you write 200 words, let's say, and I'd like you to do that in an aphorism, right, that is no more than 280 characters or something like that, right? It could probably do that.
But what I'm getting at, Steve, is can these tools, can they reveal to us the problems that we should be working on? Can they?
Yes,
can they look at knowledge and give us back a one of those possibility spaces, one of those infinites? Can we read something that AI has produced and understand?
Yes, this is something I have written about a lot, and it's this concept of undiscovered public knowledge. And this is and again, if you think about what generative AI is being fed, it is largely the academic publications. And if you look at the academic publications, you look at it from a kind of bibliometric standpoint, that is to say, you look at who's reading what, who is citing whom, right? You look at all that phenomena, you find that basically 80% of all the stuff that's being published goes pretty much uncited or unread. And in fact, very much the whole ethos of academia is to always be at the research frontier. Work on the stuff that all the smart people are working on, right? Don't work on this, and there are all these areas that are kind of marginal, and you shouldn't be working on those, right? Nobody will read your stuff. You'll never get a job. You'll never get promoted. You'll never get funding, right? But nevertheless, that is most of the material that's actually produced. Now, you see, AI doesn't come in with those biases. AI does not have the bias, right, of thinking, so if you ask AI a question, a straight question about something, right, it, in principle, should be able to search the whole knowledge space that academics have produced without prejudice and say the kinds of different possibilities and answers that are out there to address it, even if nobody has explored them before. Right? And that is a great a potential benefit of AI to help human beings utilize more of the knowledge that they themselves produce.
How do you hope intellectuals and academics will embody the concepts that you present in this book?
My own personal view is you need to be adept in multiple media, right? So in other words, you have to you have to recognize that if you want to get knowledge, ideas, whatever it is across, there's not just one way to go. And certainly the classical academic way to go is in fact becoming less and less effective in a market that has enormous numbers of competitors. And so you have to be, capable of doing podcasts. You have to be capable of doing the 30-second soundbite. You have to be capable of doing the tweet, right? You have to be capable of doing the TikTok video, right? You have to be that kind of a person who in a way can translate their ideas with relative ease into the different media, right? That it seems to me that any, intellectual of the future would have to be of that character.
Well, on that wonderful note, I hope that our audience embraces new ways of translating their ideas into these 21st century mediums. And I want to thank you for joining us for the Futures Podcast live. Steve's book, Media and the Power of Knowledge, is available from Bloomsbury Academic. If you like what you've heard, then you can download the Futures Podcast on your favorite podcasting app or follow us on social media at Futures Podcast. More episodes, live events, transcripts, and show notes can be found at futurespodcast.net. Please put your hands together and join me in thanking Professor Steve Fuller.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.